Welcome everyone. Today we have a very special guest with us here today at another session of Digital Talks hosted by the Lahore Literary Festival. We have none other than Miss Anam Zakria, who is an oral historian and an author of 3 books, including The Footprints of Partition, Narratives of 4 Generations of Pakistan and India, which won her the German Peace Prize in 2017. She also wrote Between the Great Divide, A Journey into Pakistan Administered Kashmir, and her third and latest book is 1971, People's History of Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India. Anam has her bachelor's degree from McGill in Canada, and as she also currently resides there and is also a therapist and an educationist. Welcome, Anam.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you.
And I'm also delighted to be co-moderating this session with Mr. Khalid Ahmed, who is currently the consulting editor of Newsweek Pakistan, and he is also an award-winning journalist who is a recipient of the Pride of Pakistan Award. He has also written several books, some of which include Pakistan, the State in Crisis, and Pakistan Behind the Ideological Mask. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
On that note, would you like to start the discussion, Mr. Ahmed?
Sure. Should I go ahead?
Yeah, sure. I think you should begin by telling us a little bit of your academic career and the work that you've done so far.
Sure. Thank you so much. So firstly, thank you for inviting me to be part of this digital series at LLF. And Iman, I'm delighted to be in conversation with you. And of course, it's such an honor to be speaking about my work with none other than Khalid Ahmed Saab, somebody I've always looked up to. So my academic background is in international development. I'm currently actually pursuing a degree in anthropology of violence from the University of Toronto. But it was in 2010, I had just graduated and come back to Pakistan after completing my bachelor's, that I joined the Citizens Archive of Pakistan, which is a non-profit organization here, based out of Karachi and Lahore. And I was put in charge of the oral history program. And that was kind of my introduction to oral histories. And since then, I've really kind of understood, I think, the power that oral histories have. And I've been trying in different ways to bring forth narratives from this region, from Pakistan, but also from India, Kashmir, and Bangladesh. Narratives that can, I think, help us move beyond status narratives, that can help us move beyond official history. So that's kind of, culminated in these books that I've written. And through all of them, what I've tried to explore is, these big events, these meta events that we speak about, that we learn about in our textbook history, how do they manifest for ordinary people? What are the ramifications for ordinary people, and how do they endure and survive this violence, and how do they move on? So those are some questions that have always been with me and that I've tried to explore through these books. But all of my work, of course, it's an individual capacity. So, I've been very fortunate to be able to travel. I know that in this region where visas are very hard and movement is often restricted, it's difficult to do so. But I think that I've only yet scratched the surface. As I was saying earlier, to you, Iman, I think there's so much more to learn. There's so many, diverse experiences that need to come forth. And I really believe that there's so much value in recording these narratives because in many ways, post-partition, our histories have also been partitioned, our identities have also been partitioned. So we need to access these people's history to get a little bit of a more nuanced lens into our past and how it shapes our present.
Yeah. Should I ask my first question?
Yeah, go for it.
Please do.
Yeah. About partition, there was a lot of violence in partition that led into the partitioning of 2 histories. Both the neighbors wrote histories, official histories, which were absolutely against each other. In your experience, when you were writing your counter narrative, how did you find the people's version different from the official version?
Thank you for that question. I of course grew up. I would consider myself a third generation Pakistani. So I grew up studying from the same textbooks and from the same official history. And it wasn't until I started to actually go and do these interviews with partition survivors that I realized that my understanding, the textbook understanding of partition, is very one-sided. So textbooks will often focus on one-sided violence, that Hindus and Sikhs committed on Muslims. Textbooks will often, only further those kind of truths that are convenient. And then you go on the other side of the border, or you even go to Bangladesh, and there's a very different history, right? So the same events are being interpreted and being taught very selectively. And in that process, there's an otherization and there's a dehumanization of those who live on the other side. But when I started doing these partition interviews, and I went in with this, in fact, initially I went in with this lens of only looking at partition through the violence, right? Because that's all I imagined partition as. That was my understanding of it. And suddenly I had people also speak about having, Hindu or Sikh friends if I was sitting in Pakistan, or having Muslim friends if I was sitting in India, of longing to go back and visit their homes once more, for instance, of stories of rescue, of how communities came to each other's respite during utmost violence of partition. And these were stories that I had never really encountered before, hadn't come across. And in fact, I have to say, it took me a long time to realize that when I was doing these interviews, I was also tuning in selectively. So when, the narratives would kind of reinforce what I already thought of partition, I was very attentive. But when these other stories would come out, of these intercommunal relationships and so forth, I would tune out because that wasn't the real story for me. I was looking for something else that I found as the partition truth. But I think over time, I realized that people experience partition in multiple ways, and we need to look at these narratives on a spectrum. So with that violence, there were also other experiences. And partition survivors lived in a time when the other had not yet become the other. And this is not to paint a rosy picture of there being no fault lines. Of course there were. But the idea that there was a coexistence that becomes very hard for people in my generation and younger Indians and Pakistanis to imagine today. So I think these I don't know if I, just call them counter narratives, but these people's history led us into a much more diverse and much more nuanced and pluralistic past than the myopic versions that make it to our textbooks, I think.
Thank you. Yuan?
Okay, so my question, since we're on the tangent of oral histories, I wanted to ask, how did collecting oral histories and going into different fields, traveling, and different experiences of on-ground reporting sort of help you with your understanding your history and your identity?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think it's been phenomenal and transformative. I think this whole process for me is an unlearning process. I think all these books have been a personal journey for me. So when I go into Kashmir, my job or my motivation isn't to explain Kashmir to anybody. My motivation is, as a Pakistani, to maybe unlearn, and to relearn from a Kashmiri perspective what the conflict has meant for them. So I think there's been so much growth for me going across borders, understanding that the partition story is not just my story, that it impacted people on the other side, understanding that in many ways, partition remains ongoing, especially when you speak about Kashmir, right? Understanding that, there are all these moments and times in our history where immense violence has been committed, and how can we look at the repercussions of that violence to try to avoid it in the future. So all of that has been very important. I think also understanding that we need to look at conflict and violence and war through a gendered perspective has been critical. I didn't understand the necessity of that until actually I went to Kashmir and I started interviewing women and children living on the line of control and realized how differently conflict affects women, which I think has given me a much more gendered lens, or at least I'm attempting towards a more gendered lens in my work, but also beyond. So I think, all these trips, these visits across borders, my trip to Bangladesh have been so important in my own unlearning, relearning process. These all, in many ways, personal projects for me. And through these stories that I collect that have helped my unlearning, I hope that they can also help some of the readers, maybe unlearn or learn new dimensions to that past.
Thank you for that.
Tell me, because of the two narratives which dominate India and Pakistan in the textbooks, do you think that affects the attitude of the ordinary citizen when he thinks about the minorities. For instance, in both countries, the treatment of the minorities is now in question. Do you think that it is the official textbook which is causing this rift to take place?
I think that textbooks play a very central role. I don't think that it's all about textbooks. I think that, it's also reinforced through media and through other mediums. But I think textbooks do play a critical role because many Indians and Pakistanis, if we talk about these two countries in specific, they're not meeting each other. Gallup Pakistan did a survey a few years back, and they found that 76% of Pakistanis have never met an Indian. So our first kind of, site where we access or imagine Indians or Pakistanis are usually schools and textbooks. And of course, teachers are also studying from similar textbooks. Even classroom conversations beyond text, are around similar kind of stereotypes. And I think what we've seen, with partition, is this crystallization and this increasing rise of religious nationalism, where the question of belonging, the question of patriotism is so linked to religion. So children today, when I go into classrooms, I do these exchanges between India and Pakistan. When I work with children in Pakistan, for instance, it's very hard for them to understand that Shah Rukh Khan can be both Muslim and Indian. They will insist that Shah Rukh Khan has to be Pakistani. And when I say no, then they say that then he has to be Hindu. Right? So those kind of equations happen. And I think the gravest repercussions of this, of course, are on minorities on both sides of the border. Because once you imagine that nation belongs to a particular religious community, then anyone who does not fit is the other. Right, is somebody who can be asked to go back. And so you hear calls, in India, but go back to Pakistan. That are kind of thrust on Muslims. In Pakistan, I know that many people will refer to Pakistani Hindus as Indians. So those kind of, labels or connotations that do emerge from textbooks, but also from larger kind of discourse in society, I think have a profound influence in how we imagine each other and who we imagine to be one of us and who we imagine to be the other. And then in extreme cases, of course, violence can also become justified because you're not truly patriotic or you're not truly loyal to the nation state. So I think these textbooks have an impact. And when I work with children, in classrooms, I can see that children, they absorb what you teach them. So just as quickly as they learn this hate sentiment, and as reluctant as they will be to speak to each other many times, they're also curious. And when I do these exchanges, I've had opinions change so quickly. I'll just share one anecdote that I've shared previously in several talks. Of a child in Mumbai, a 7th grader, after a 20-minute conversation with me, kind of getting up and saying, now I know that all Pakistanis are not murderers, I can think of going there too. So that leaves me with the question always, had I not had that interaction, what would this child have continued to imagine? How does the other, how are Pakistanis and Indians essentially becoming monsters for each other? And what role are textbooks playing? What role are teachers' attitudes playing? What role is media playing? And what role are high-level politics playing in this?
Yeah.
Okay, so I would like to dive straight into your new book. I wanted to ask a bit more about the difference between Bengali and Bangladeshi, since we're entering into that period in history where everyone's being more inclusive and we're trying to better ourselves by understanding different cultures, different religions, different races. What is the difference between Bangladeshi and Bengali from your secondary as well as primary sources?
That's an interesting question. I mean, the simple answer to this is, of course, that Bengali is an ethnic identity and Bangladeshi identity would be linked much more to the nation state. But when I went to Bangladesh, again, my limited research, there's much more to learn. But what people said to me in those visits and in those interactions that I had with Bangladeshis was that there have been this polarizing kind of nationalism that's developed, one being Bangladeshi nationalism and the other being Bengali nationalism. On the surface level, I'm told that Bengali nationalism, of course, is meant to be more inclusive. It is meant to extend to communities and ethnic groups beyond Bengalis. Ethnic Bengalis would include Chakma people, for instance, but also I met, some Punjabis and Balochis, people from West Pakistan who married into East Pakistani families and then stayed on after 71. So this is supposed to be a more inclusive nation-making process. But then there are also others who feel that Bangladeshi nationalism over time has, masked a lot of inequalities and has, in fact, taken on connotations as being Islamist or pro-Pakistan. And so there are others who say that only Bengali nationalism can really, capture the secular sentiments that we had at 71. And so many people will hold on to that Bengali nationalism. So I think it's a complicated question, and it continues to be debated in present-day Bangladesh.
Do you think now that Bangladesh has become a secular socialist country, they have a new constitution, and their national anthem is now in Bengali? It is actually a poem from Tagore. Do you think that the man in the street has accepted this change of identity of the state?
To the Bangladeshi state?
Bangladeshi state which has become secular and more Bengali language centered.
I think from my basic reading, I think it continues to be a polarizing issue. I think that even both the major kind of political parties over there, Awami League and Bangladesh National Party, tend to hold on to either or. So Bengali nationalism is something that's more associated with the Awami League, and Bangladeshi nationalism with BNP. And I think there's this constant tussle between the secular or the more Islamist kind of elements in society. So I don't think that question has been resolved, if I can put it that way. I think it's an ongoing kind of question from at least the experiences I had there.
So when you were talking to the people in Bangladesh, you could see this bifurcation, that there are two kinds of thinking there.
Yes, there are two kinds of things. And I think what's happened in the post-71 years, just as we were talking about partitioned histories and, partitioning of identities, the conversation has become very much about whether you're pro-liberation, pro-India, anti-liberation, pro-Pakistan. So there are these kind of binary at the political level, these bifurcations, and you're supposed to espouse one or the other. And of course, that has an impact at the people's level too, but there's also, a struggle at the people's level to kind of defy this and to go back to what they see as a much more inclusive idea of Bangladesh.
That could actually also contain a nostalgia for Pakistan. Is there any nostalgia?
That I came across, so I have to, say that because I went to interview people on 71, a lot of our conversations were extremely charged, and they were about the violence of 71. But having said that, of course, people spoke about the years, between 47 and 71. They spoke about their friends. They also spoke about, how much it hurt them to see not just Bengalis, but also non-Bengalis, friends who were, who succumbed to that violence, who were inflicted violence on. So there is that kind of feeling. And I think one of the things that, and maybe I get a chance to read this towards the end, is that I noticed that whereas in official history, we imagine 1971, 16 December to be the date that Bangladesh was created, for people, this Bangladeshi identity emerged and became their own identity at very different moments. So for the older generations, those who were staunch Muslim Leaguers, we can't forget that we may not have even had the kind of Pakistan we have today had it not been for the support in East Bengal for the Muslim League, when Muslim League was actually created. So those who were staunch Muslim Leaguers and who really believed in the Pakistani identity and Pakistani nationalism found it much harder to let go. And so I think in many ways, you kind of still see those intergenerational, differences, even within families that emerged at that time, that for many got resolved in 71, but that doesn't mean that that's a chapter of your life that you can completely, put away. So those feelings or even those connections or relationships you had with those who are now Pakistani continue, I think, to shape many people's relationship with Pakistan today. I think it's not so simple at the people's level.
Yes, Ima?
Okay, so I'm going to come back to your novel again, and I want to explore a bit of the 1971 history. I want to talk a bit more about the language factor in the division of East and West Pakistan and the issue of the lingua franca and all of that.
Yes, I mean, language, of course, we know this, right? It became one of the earliest points of contention between the two wings. And, in many ways, I think it was also tied to that whole religio-nationalist kind of nationalisms that were emerging. So, it was seen as a language that was derived from Sanskrit and therefore was not as Islamic. And so I think language, more than just being about communication, also became symbolic of Bengali culture, and then of course was tied very much to economic rights and economic kind of mobility. What I'm going to do actually is I'm just going to read out a few lines from the book at this point. This is a passage from an interview with Dr. Tariq Rahman, Pakistani scholar, of course. And I think I'd like to borrow his words here because I think he put it beautifully, what the language issue represented. So he says, language is a way of communication, but it is also a symbol of identity. It communicates more than words. It communicates a people. And if you look down upon a language, there are many things that you don't want to do using it. You don't want to speak in it. If you speak in it, you make no effort to correct your pronunciation. You don't want to hear it. If you hear it, you make no effort to understand it. There are various ways in which you are given cues that your language is not worthy. The linguistic ideology is such that if you value a language, you will try your best to speak it, read its literature, to pronounce it as well as the native speakers, and make all efforts to try and understand it. Even when Bengali was declared a national language, it continued to be used there in East Pakistan and not here in West Pakistan. So it wasn't national in that sense. And when West Pakistanis went to East Pakistan, they never learned Bangla. And if they did, they spoke it like Englishmen, arrogant Englishmen. Obviously, the Bengalis didn't like this. If you speak their language only to give them commands, it means you're treating them like servants. So I read this passage because I think a lot of times, when I go into even classrooms today, children will say, oh, well, why couldn't the Bengalis just learn Urdu? And, it comes down to this question about one language or the other language. So I think it's important to understand that language symbolizes much more than just a mode of communication. And language became representative, I think, of the larger kind of disparity between the two wings and a kind of derogatory attitude towards Bengali culture.
And became a tool of dissent for the Bengalis as well during this time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that makes me think of your book on Lahore and the memories of Lahore. Some people think that the golden age of Lahore was when big literature, Urdu literature was born, and Lahore was not yet undergone partition. What is your sense of Lahore? Because there is a nostalgia of Lahore in the books written by people who have left Lahore since then.
There's a huge nostalgia of Lahore. When you go to Delhi and you mention that you're from Lahore, suddenly people will be, collecting all around you, and they will want to know about Mall Road, and they will want to know about GC and, so many other places. I think that nostalgia very much continues. I would even say that even in Bangladesh, there were people who had lived in Lahore, who had memories from this time, who spoke fondly of it. But I think that when we look at 71 and we look at the Bangladeshi experience, and Punjab and Lahore bring up other connotations as well. And they do bring up connotations of this kind of larger disparity and of this, of Punjabi kind of even language becoming subservient to Urdu, right? And so I think that it depends on where you sit. If you speak to families who move from Lahore or who move to Lahore, there will be that nostalgia and that longing and that kind of pride and the cultural vibrancy, and of course that's there. But I think that when you go to Bangladesh, then those experiences are very, very different because there was first-hand kind of inequality experience. So there, that nostalgia is, when I said I was from Punjab, it did not evoke very pleasant kind of emotions for people. And, they did not, at first want to speak to a Punjabi, to a Pakistani, because it represents more than just the cultural hub that it does for many Lahoris and those who move from Lahore.
I want to focus a bit more on the relations between the two countries at that point, as well as this point, because a lot of people had I mean, wars are naturally bloody and plunderous, but at the same time, there were also instances where there were stories of brotherhood, connection, and love. And I want you to explore a bit more of that in light of the war, and then how people tapped into their common humanism to achieve that.
You know, Iman, there's so many stories like this, and I'll go back to partition for just a moment. You know, Ashish Nandi is a Indian political psychologist who's done phenomenal work on partition. You know, some of his work shows that about 40% of partition stories are actually rescue stories. Right, so these are stories of people risking their lives and coming to help each other from across communities. And I, in my experience, when whatever work I've done so far, I've always seen a strong resonance of humanity kind of prevailing even amidst utmost violence. So that's the same situation in 71, you know, whether I'm sitting in Pakistan or whether I'm sitting in Bangladesh, the interviewees often spoke about the fact that they wouldn't even be there had those from other communities not helped them. And these are, again, stories that don't make it to our official history. They don't make it to official textbooks. But, you know, for instance, I remember doing a bunch of interviews in Karachi with West Pakistanis who were working on the tea estates in Sylhet and other places in Bangladesh. And they were only saved because Bengalis, you know, gave them refuge in their own homes and then helped them actually cross the border and come back to Pakistan. Similarly, some of the Bihari families I interviewed in Karachi also spoke about neighbors who came to their relief. And very similarly, you know, in Bangladesh as well, many Bengalis spoke about, you know, Biharis that actually saved them. So I know that in official historiography and in many people's experiences, in many people's real experiences, these communities, you know, inflicted immense violence on each other, and that is the truth, and we can't undermine it or trivialize it in any way. But alongside these stories, you also had these people, members from the same communities coming forth and in fact really risking their own lives at that time, you know, because to be helping the other could be construed as being traitor or as being anti-state, but they did help. And so there are many stories like that which really don't get captured. And that's why I think people's history can be such an effective way of moving beyond those limited community charged kind of identities we have.
There is
No,
another people.
sorry.
There is another people that you have talked to, and those are the Kashmiris. What kind of uh, opinion that you gathered from their living between two countries who are disputing them while not really caring for how they live and how they go about in life?
So yeah, that's really what got me, you know, to do this work on Kashmir, because I went as a tourist to the Pakistani side of Kashmir, and I realized how limited my understanding was as a Pakistani, and how Kashmiri lives have been reduced to this bilateral tit for tat battle between India and Pakistan, and Kashmiri voices and Kashmiri people and Kashmiri lives are kind of being sandwiched in between. And I think that there is an increasing awareness of that within the Kashmiri public, and there is a resistance to that. But of course, you know, the reality of the situation is that there are these two big powers, and Kashmiri lives, you know, on the LOC and beyond continue to be sandwiched in between. And everything we've seen August 5th onwards, especially, you know, on the Indian side of Kashmir, has only exacerbated the situation. So, you know, the sentiment, even on the Pakistani side and of course on the Indian side, is that Kashmiri voices are often drowned out in the jingoistic kind of rhetoric that goes back and forth between India and Pakistan. So for instance, even, you know, in Pakistani papers, we'll often hear about ceasefire violations, we'll hear so many dead, but no one really knows what that actually means for Kashmiri lives, right? No one really knows what it means to live on the line of control, and to live on the line of control without having basic respite, like bunkers not being provided for people. So whereas, you know, India and Pakistan both talk a lot about Kashmir, they don't really do as much for Kashmiri lives on ground, and that is a very kind of explicit sentiment that you find when you go to Kashmir.
Would you like to read out an excerpt or a few excerpts that sort of signify or identify the cultural anxieties as well as the personal desires of the people at the time in 1971?
Sure. So I think what I'll do, Iman, is I'll speak I'll read from a passage which speaks to the intergenerational kind of, transition from being Pakistani to being Bangladeshi. So, okay. The struggle for building an emancipated, secular Bengal within the Islamic Republic of Pakistan wouldn't come without its challenges. For Tariq, the struggle also manifested in his own home, where his ideals clashed with those of his father. My father was from Aligarh and a Muslim League supporter, he explains. There was an ongoing conflict between us. He was part of an establishment that felt that their Islamic identity was more important than anything else. It was a paternalistic society, and we were taught to always respect our parents. So I didn't say anything to my father directly, but I kept engaging in activities outside which made him angry. He reprimanded me until up to 69. It was only in 1970, when power wasn't handed over to Mujib after the elections, that he started to change his mind. He would ask, how can the government do this? Tariq's father was a government servant who had received his PhD degree in fisheries from Stanford University in 49. He had gone to the US on a Government of India scholarship, and it was while he was there that partition happened. He opted for Pakistan. So he went as an Indian and returned as a Pakistani. He was a staunch Muslim League supporter, as so many were in his generation, particularly in Bengal. Tariq tells me that his support for the Muslim League continued till 1970, even though he wasn't insulated from the discrimination Bengalis experienced in government jobs. And he wasn't the only one. I would later collect several other narratives in which the generational differences in ideological thought were stark. One of my interviewees, who was 15 at the time of the war, would tell me, my father didn't want independence. He had faced discrimination in India and thought Pakistan would help Muslims develop. It was 25th March that became the turning point for him. Before that, he was adamant against separation. Another man I interviewed told me, my father had seen the Calcutta riots. He had almost been killed. So for him, Pakistan meant something else, and he supported it till the very end. From these few interviews, it seemed as if it was harder for people in the older generations, those who had fought for Pakistan's creation, to give up on the idealism. While many young students would begin protesting against what they saw as Pakistani hegemony from as early on as the 40s and 50s, the older generation would resist. Pakistan was meant to be the refuge, the sanctuary from discrimination and violence so many of them had personally witnessed in undivided India. The way the events of 71 transpired, however, rattled them. Several of my interviewees told me they couldn't believe what they were seeing before them, the events of and after March 25th finally shattering the Pakistan dream. And I'll just give forward to Tariq's own narrative because he was very young, a student activist at this time. Says, my friend who was a teacher and I left at 6 a.m. one morning. I think it was the second week of May by then. I hadn't told anyone at home. I just left a letter for my father with a friend and told him to only hand it over after 2 days had passed, so my father couldn't catch me. I remember we walked the entire day on this dirt road which led to the border. In the horizon, we could see smoke coming out of burnt homes. The border was still very porous, and there was no security. We crossed over and somebody said, now you're in India. I walked back to what was then East Pakistan and took some soil and kissed it. He paused for a moment and I noticed his voice was beginning to crack. It took him a few seconds to speak again. I said, I will return to you, my mother, my soil. This time his resolve broke. He couldn't continue. He folded his elbows on the table and began to cry silently, his body shaking with each sob. I said, I will only return when I can come to you as an independent soil, he finished after a while, the words forming slowly. While Tariq desired to become an army officer and fight for Bangladesh, he received a prompt rejection when he went to Calcutta for recruitment. He was told he couldn't serve in the army due to his poor eyesight. Demotivated and unsure, it was then that he met his guru. He not only offered me music lessons, but also educated students in political thought. He told me of his music group, which would travel to the Mukti Bahini camps as well as the refugee camps and asked me to join. It was during this time that I rediscovered the artist in me. We would sing songs about Bengal, about Hindu-Muslim inclusivity. It was only in January 72 that Tariq returned, this time as a Bangladeshi. He told me that this was a difficult day. The long struggle had come with too many losses. It was very hard to rejoice. I was so emotional. A few days before the war, I had lost two of my friends. So many people had been killed. That day, we just wept. However, by the time he would fly to Dhaka, some of the euphoria would seep through. I took the first Indian Airlines flight to Dhaka, he laughs, the air light for the first time in our conversation. I think I felt what so many Mahajirs felt when they first landed in Pakistan. They came with a fantastic dream of a society in which they would be the masters of their own selves. That's the dream we had for Bangladesh. And what about your father? I asked. What was it like to meet him? What did he feel about independence? He had seen a lot. By July, my uncles had been shot dead. By August, other relatives were killed. By the time the war ended, my father had come out of his dream of a strong Pakistan. When I met him, he had turned into a strong Bangladeshi, and he passed away as a strong Bangladeshi. So I'll end there, but I think that this narrative speaks to those, very kind of personal transitions from being Pakistani, from being Indian to Pakistani, and then to being Bangladeshi. Thank you so much for listening.
Yeah, I was thinking, Iman, go ahead.
No, I'm done with my questions. If you have a question, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking of how the three countries in South Asia, Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, are now treating their minorities. They may be Biharis in Bangladesh, there could be Muslims now in India, and we have a bad record of the minorities here. Have you talked to, in your narrative, have you been talking to the minority elements inside Pakistan, and how do they see their life?
Yes, I have, so in the partition book, I've spoken to, the Zoroastrian community, the Hindu community. Of course, when I went to India as well, I have interviewed some Muslims there, some minorities there. But for Bangladesh, if I can just speak about that for a moment, when I went there, I was able to visit the camps that many Biharis continue to live in and kind of record their narrative, but also speak to the Hindu community in Bangladesh and their experiences. And in Pakistan, I also spoke to the Bengali community, a community that I think we don't hear much about in Pakistan, we don't think much about, but there are, of course, Bengali Pakistanis, and many of them, like Biharis on the other side, continue to struggle with basic paperwork, with basic kind of identity documents, and have to face the ongoing kind of, impact of this violence and conflict and war. It hasn't ended for them. And similarly, when in my work with the Hindu community, interviews with the Christian community, even the Sikh community, Zoroastrian community. I think one of the common themes that emerges, apart from, of course, socioeconomic disparity and violence, is this constant sense of feeling vulnerable. Constantly being put in a position where your loyalty can be questioned, where your patriotism can be questioned. So anytime anything happens in India, it is often the Hindus in Pakistan that feel the need to come out and really assert the Pakistani-ness. And similarly in India, whether it's cricket matches or anything else, Muslims are often kind of asked to prove their loyalty. So I think that the repercussions are grave. And in all my books, I have tried to speak to minorities because I think that it is increasingly important to understand the ramifications of high-level politics on ordinary people. If we are to kind of find any kind of solution, we need to hear people's experiences.
What we are getting a bad press about is the Hindu community down in Sindh. They are very close to Sindhi culture. They go to the same shrines, but somehow they're not being treated very well, especially women and girls.
Yes.
Anything that in your experience about that?
I haven't worked on that directly, but I do work on, the ongoing partition, essentially. That's what I call it, the journey of partition, post-partition. And I find that these forced conversions that happen of young girls, and we keep hearing about them, are a manifestation of this ongoing partition where, again, this kind of heightened religious nationalism and this idea of who is to be patriotic today. And this idea that if you're Hindu and you're Pakistani, you don't truly belong. I think it comes back to that question of belonging. And that, of course, women suffer the most. Obviously, as I was saying earlier, the kind of the ways that conflict impacts women, that violence that impacts, the way the violence impacts women is so starkly different. And I think these forced conversions are a manifestation of it. I think the lynchings you've seen, in India recently against the Muslim community are also ongoing manifestations of it. So I haven't directly worked with, families where this has happened, but for me, it speaks to the larger kind of otherization and larger kind of, equation of religious identity with national identity. that's happening on all sides of the border.
Now that your books have been published, and I think it's a very good effort to actually oppose the official textbook narrative, and perhaps then people will learn that reality is quite different from the kind of brainwash we get from our textbooks. Do you think your books will kind of help in correcting the minds of the people?
I would hope so, and I would love for that to be the case. I am aware, though, that of course, there's limited kind of outreach. They are written in English, so they're reaching out to a limited audience in that sense as well. What I do try to do is, kind of bring in these oral histories as my work as an educationist and my work as a cultural facilitator. So I try to organize these conversations between Indians and Pakistanis, and that's where I try to bring in some of these stories, because I think we need to get inside classrooms, and we need to kind of change the way we teach. The pedagogy around teaching, but also the text around teaching. And so through that, I hope I can reach out to a slightly wider audience, but I think more needs to be done. And at an institutional level, we need to, include these oral histories within the institutional frameworks. In India, you did see the state textbooks actually include Urvashi Bhatalia's oral histories from the other side of silence. I think that kind of work can have profound impact on the younger generations. And we need that because the younger generations are far more partitioned, far more hostile, far more prejudiced today. So I can only hope that these narratives can help us humanize each other, even just a little bit.
What would be your advice to people who write textbooks for children in Pakistan? Can we actually intervene a little bit and make them mild rather than conflictual?
I think it's a tough battle. I think there's so many people who've been trying to work on the curriculum and amend it. I think the only message I have for textbooks and everything else is that our patriotism does not have to be based on hostility of the other. So if we feel that we need to have these jingoistic, ideologically driven texts because that is what will instill patriotism, I think we're mistaken. I think that is doing harm in all countries. So I think we need to move beyond that jingoistic lens, and be open to multiple experiences coming in. That's not going to make anyone less patriotic or less Pakistani or less Indian. It will just make us more tolerant, more educated, and enable a more diverse and pluralistic society. And we all need that.
And what is your advice to parents who get their children coming from their school full of prejudice? How can the parents help in moderating the view that is being spread by the textbook among our children?
I think the parents have a really important role to play, unfortunately, because many of them are also studying from same textbook. Sometimes these notions get reinforced, but I think as parents, there are so many interventions we can make, because I have seen students, who mirror these textbook sentiments, and I've seen students who don't. And that obviously indicates that there's stuff happening outside these textbooks, right? There are interventions that teachers can make. And then when you go home, if you are privileged enough, of course, travel is something that really helps. So, getting your children outside these spaces, even, within the same country, to be able to access different parts of your own country, to be able to access different narratives, but also literature outside textbooks. Talks now within the age of social media. There's so much online, and there's a really interesting work happening. The History Project is doing really interesting work in Pakistan to kind of mend these divides between school children. There are resources that are now available, on partitioned histories and how to move beyond them. So I think that parents can bring in this other literature, can bring in movies, and can, I think most importantly, have conversations with children and help them deconstruct these stereotypes and speak about other truths, other experiences, and essentially, whether you're speaking about Hindus or you're speaking about any other community, talk about being human first and having a humanizing lens rather than an otherizing and demonizing lens. I think as parents, if we can inculcate that, and we can allow or, instill or enable children to have a more nuanced lens, then the textbooks won't be the only sources of history and learning and identity.
Thank you for that, Anam. I think the session has elapsed because we're a bit ahead of
I think it was
time now.
wonderful.
Yeah, but
And it
thank
was
you.
wonderful. It was really good experience listening to you.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor.
Thank you for all your wealth of knowledge and your readings as well. They're very informative, very educative, and I really appreciate your point of view on a lot of things, especially history and your counter narrative perspective and oral histories.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having
Thank
me.
you very much, Anam. Great.
And thank you to everyone who is watching, and thank you to everyone who comes every week and watches us at LLF. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.